Awesome. Welcome, everybody. We're so happy to have you here. My name is Karis Shearer. I'm a professor of English here at UBC-O Okanagan. I want to start our event today. This is the archival workshop by acknowledging that we live and work on the unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan people. And I'm very grateful that we're here. I'm joined today by my amazing colleague. Here she is.
Hi, everyone. My name is Linda Morra. I am a professor of English at Bishop's University, although I'm currently the Farley Distinguished Visiting Scholar at Simon Fraser University, which is in part what also brings me here. Very lovely to see everyone.
Good morning. I'm going to briefly introduce all the panelists who are joining us today. Some of them are online and some of them are in the room with me today. And I'll just give a brief introduction. The full speaker bios are in a handout here in the room, and they will be on the blog, the AMPLAB blog, shortly after. So speaking today about the 10 best practices of archival research, we have Sarah Cipes, who is the AMPLAB PRC fellow and a PhD student in digital arts and humanities here. She also has a master's degree in information science in archives and record management. We have Paige Hohmann, who is the archivist at the UBC-O Okanagan Library here, and she manages the special collections and archives. Daniel Keyes is an associate professor in the Faculty of Creative and Critical Studies. He's also a professor of cultural studies and English. Linda Morra, who you've just met. We have Dr. Emily Murphy, who is an assistant professor of English and digital humanities here at UBC-O Okanagan. We have Tim Paulson, who's an assistant professor of environmental and economic history at UBC-O Okanagan. Margaret Reeves, who's an associate professor of English and cultural studies and associate member of the Gender and Women's Studies program. We have myself, I've already introduced myself. We also have Jessica Stites Mor, who is an associate professor of history. So that is our lineup today. We're delighted to have everybody. And Linda, do you want to tell us a little bit, what is this work? Yes. What are we here for?
Yes, so we developed this workshop in response to a growing need, I think, for those who are entering archives for the first time, although we then began to realize that it was important to do this kind of workshop, even for those who have been in archives several times. So we compiled a list of techniques and tips for how to approach an archive and what to do once you're actually there. So we hope it's useful and practical for everyone.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge before we start as well that this workshop is modeled after a workshop that Linda co-organized with her colleague at Simon Fraser University, Dr. Betty Schellenberg. And it's important to acknowledge that because it's directly modeled off of that work. Yeah, and thank you so much. We have people joining us from literally around the world this morning. So welcome, and let's oh, I'm 2 minutes early. Excellent. We have a timer prepared, and I'm very conscious of it. Our first speaker today is Paige Hohmann. Sarah Cipes is going to share the slides and shift the spotlight onto Paige.
Right. We should let everyone know that there is a timer that will go off when our speakers hit the 4-minute mark. It'll sound a little rude, but it's just a way of alerting them to the fact that we've hit their time.
As Emily said, it's a feminist timekeeping practice.
Yes. Feminist practice.
Okay.
Over to me. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. So first of all, thank you for inviting me to participate in this workshop. As Karis introduced me, my name is Paige Hohmann. I work with archives and special collections. So that positions me as a practitioner of archives as opposed to a researcher. So I think that it is helpful for me to talk about, archives as place and how and where to locate those at the outset of a research project. I'm joining you today from Burnaby. I wish I could be with you today, but I'm really looking forward to this program and the other panelists. So my archival best practice to get things going is to locate the archive that might hold the material that you're seeking. So you can see here that I kind of have the same statement repeated twice. One is locate the capital A archive, and one is locate the little a archive. And that means two different but related things. The capital A archive is the repository or the place that holds the records. And the little A archive are the documents and the traces that are contained within it. So this can be a challenging thing to try to do if you've not done archival research before. But the main thing to keep in mind is consider provenance before you consider pertinence, or in other words, consider the source before you consider the subject. So archives, such as they are being records, are traces of activity, and they're related to things that have taken place in the world. So that could mean supporting a process, backing up a decision, or claiming a right, among many other activities. They're not necessarily going to be organized or compiled based on what they are about. So when you're locating those archives, it's important to walk it back a step or two. Start off with a consideration of who might have done the activity that would have yielded the records that have the evidence that you're looking for, where those records might have ended up. That will lead you to the repository where you might find it. And it's important also to keep in mind that the way they're organized, they're going to be different from a library. So in a library catalog, you can search by subject, but it's always good to start by thinking of who might have created the materials and what are the filters or the barriers that might have prevented them from ending up where you might consider them to be predictable. Often universities will have special collections or archival divisions, and that's a good place to start. Another place that you might do is do a web search with keywords such as historical society, archive, museum, because the geography can be really important in terms of narrowing down where the records are held. So as you go and start, it's important to remember that often archival research will come in the middle or at the end of a larger research endeavor, and that there are many things that can prevent archives from showing up where you might expect them. They might not have been created in the first place. They may not have been moved to a repository, or a repository may not have actually ended up accepting them. So keeping a flexible mindset as you're thinking about locating them will be helpful, as well as tracing citations back from secondary sources. So that's a fairly simple introduction to it. I know that I'm nowhere near the 4-minute mark, but I think that wraps up the idea of locating the archives and trying to figure out exactly where they're going to be when you're looking for them. Thank you.
Paige, that's fantastic. You are exactly on the 4-minute mark.
Oh, fantastic. Great.
Beautifully choreographed. We have 1 minute if there are other folks who want to add any thoughts or perspectives on this best practice. Okay, Paige, thank you so much for that. We'll move to best practice number 2, which is being presented by Dr. Jessica Stites Mor. And I'm so curious about this slide.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Jessica Stites Mor. Hi to those of you who aren't here present. I'm an historian, and so archives are very important to my work. And the slide that I'm giving today has a lot to do with, the amount of time you spend planning. And my biggest mistake when I started early in my career was to not give myself enough time, both to get to know the archive and also to know the archivists. And so this slide is just an example of one of the many things that I found that I wasn't actually looking for. So some of the problems you encounter when you actually get to an archive are that documents have to be sometimes requested well in advance. They might actually be off-site in another location. So you need to go in with enough time to allow the staff to be able to pull things for you, and also to be able to think with you around the topics of your subject of research to see if there are things that they might have known about that weren't yet cataloged, or to know how they've classified things within their system so that they can help give you better access to the materials in the collection. This image, for example, was something I found when I went to an archive in Havana that was meant to be an archive of a particular press. And I had no idea when I went that they also had cataloged all of the other materials from every other magazine and publication in the country that they were in conversation with, so that when they would have to go back through and do fact checking to see what had been already published on subjects, they'd have an immediate resource. And so I learned that I had only planned 2 days in this archive, but I really needed about 4 weeks. Because not only did I find a beautiful collection of materials, this one is actually, just to answer Karis's question, this is a magazine produced by the military in Cuba. And it was designed for encouraging young people to think about military service in its variety of capacity. This is the military magazine. This issue is 1988. And so, as conscription and participation in the military was highly kind of prized activity, they also had this sort of mission to convince people that they'd still have fun, that if they were doing this with their years of kind of early adult life, that they'd still get to have, I guess this is like beach blanket bingo type of. And so I had no idea that there was this entire wealth of stuff that was related to the project that I was doing on photography that opened up this whole new window into gender relations and how these images were being captured. So for my students, when I send them on their way to archives, I tell them, make sure you're in good communication in advance with the archivist so that you already are talking about your project. They already are starting to get ideas. And when you get there, have time to have coffee, to sit and think together, for them to have their own sort of input in terms of what they think you might be able to be directed to. And then also give yourself enough time to just get totally lost. You may have no idea what kind of wealth of resources are there that could even be, off of the catalog pages themselves. So that's my slide. And yeah, I think I'm under 4.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Also perfectly timed. Any comments or additional thoughts on giving yourself time in the archives?
I would just say that that's quite right, that sometimes the project that you anticipate is ends up being much larger than the one that then surfaces in the archive. And so it's always better to add a good few days on top of what you think you'll need. I agree with that.
Yeah, I've definitely had archival visits where I'm like, oh, 2-day visit should have been 2 weeks, as you said, or it's many more days than you actually thought. Thank you so much. Our next best practice is by Dan Hayes, who's going to talk about planning a trip to the archives.
Thank you, Karis. So we could probably just go to the second slide, and I'm just going to sit like this, so that'll work. Whiteness, I could tilt it, but okay, there we go. So a lot of my research looks at small little sad archives, we can call them, that are underfunded in the South Okanagan and the Okanagan into whiteness. And so this is my favorite archive because it's a curling rink that was condemned and is now the museum and archive for the Assoc district. And so it's very important to plan a visit to this archive or any archive. So I give this as a kind of model. And my first step is, well, go and check out the website. Now, if you were to click that link, you would find that it's using Adobe Flash, which doesn't work. And the entire site is looks really, really sad. And so if you're in BC, the places that you can go are the Excellent Memory BC, which gives you, if you click this link, it will give you the complete kind of fawns, holdings, and everything that's at the archive, which is a good way to kind of prepare to kind of go, okay, well, they might have something that I want there, or they might not. I don't have to go to it. The great thing about this curling rink as archive is that there are barn swallows that fly around inside it. And so one of the things preparing for this would be bring a hat, which I would never have thought of when I went to this archive, that I would need a hat. So that's always, if we come to the next slide, my next tip is always ask the archivist, is there anything I need to know? That is very important. So step 2, draft that introductory email. Introduce yourself and your research, let the archivist know what you're looking for. This is what I want. Ask the archivist directly, are relevant materials likely to be available? And confirm that day of operation, and particularly with the Assoc archive, where it's woefully underfunded, and the archivist may not be working that day or maybe doing other stuff, because it's a museum and they're trying to get the barn swallows out of the building. So it's important to kind of book those sorts of things and make sure that you can arrive, and that whole sense of timing, that you'll arrive and go, oh, there's so much here I didn't anticipate. That's part of kind of, hopefully by sending this email and making that introduction, you can get a sense. It's actually going to take me 2 weeks, or it's going to take me a week, because I've opened up that kind of rejoinder. And always explain the equipment that you might be bringing and what the limitations around there might be. We don't have a plug-in. We'll have to get you an extension cord. I can bring my own. That's okay. And check if there are any concerns. Do they want us to wear white gloves? Am I allowed to use ink, or can I only have a pencil? Those are kind of the nice kind of things to ask. And that last question there is, it's about the barn swallows. Like, is there anything I need to know? And that to me is just like that open question at the end is, that'll do it. So that's sort of all I have to offer there. I did, is that under 3 minutes? Or?
Oh, yeah, perfect.
Perfect. Okay. Great.
Yeah, thank you so much. Is there anything the other presenters would like to add? Margaret?
Just one thing again, mentioned font. So it's for the larger archives, it's important to know that not everything to be archived owns is actually on its website. And sometimes they have these finding aids, they're called, the fonts that will contain a list. But these things are often on paper or in binders inside the library or the archive. And so that's part of the answer to Dan's last question. The archivist can then tell you, what fonts or finding aids you're going to want to consult when you're there.
Yeah, thank you so much. For those who maybe didn't hear that online, Margaret Reeves is pointing out that finding aids and there are other resources available that archivists know about and may not be online. And we have a slide on that coming up. So was there another, Linda?
Further to that, sometimes the materials are not on site either. And so they take a couple of days. That's also why one would need time in the archive. The materials sometimes take a couple of days to arrive.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. So without further ado, Sarah Cipes is going to be talking about finding materials in the archives.
Yes, thank you, Margaret. That was a perfect introduction. Okay, so before you enter the archive, you're going to want to familiarize yourself with how to find materials that are existent within there and that are relevant to your topic. The first thing I want you guys to know is that you need to have a flexible topic. If you're a student and you don't have an additional 4 weeks to do archival research, you need to be able to pare it down. This is one font, and it's not even very big, and it is 14 boxes, and it has a 131-page finding aid. I know because I wrote it. You do not want to have to go through 131 pages because your topic is Mildred Wardlaw, and you have not pared that down. So let's say you come across this, you do want to write something about Mildred Wardlaw, just look into the finding aid and see if you can sort of add an additional aspect to your topic. For me, because I know this font, I would want to do Mildred Wardlaw and her correspondence with BC bylaw officers, because she wrote limericks about potholes on her street and sent them to BC bylaw officers as a way to try to get it fixed, which— Can I get a copy of that? You got to go in there. That's the only option. So yeah, I just wanted you guys to see how much material you might be dealing with and how important it is to be super flexible. Be sure to know that you might have to broaden your topic. You might have to really zoom it in. But either way, you're going to be dealing directly with something called finding aids. Can you? Thank you, Megan. Okay, so finding aids are documents that mirror everything within the archive. Essentially, you can look at them as a descriptive document that helps you figure out where everything is that you are trying to find. So what you're going to find on, this is a digital finding aid. There are a lot of different kinds. Sometimes they're only accessible to the archivist, so you have to contact them directly via, they can see everything via database, but they don't want everyone else to have access to it. Sometimes it's paper. Not as much anymore, but sometimes it's a mix of both. This is a digital finding aid from the UTSC website, which is University of Toronto Scarborough campus. And they
this is something you could find online. So it's like pretty simple. What you can generally expect to find is reference code. So that's something that you don't need to know anything about. That's for the archivist. It's going to have the dates, the title, which could be created by the archivist or could have come with the objects. It's going to have the extent, which is usually in meters. You don't have to worry about that, except that it'll give you an idea of how much material you might have to go through. So you're going to want to pare down if it's in meters. If it's in centimeters, you're probably okay. On this side, we've got the context area. This is like really what I usually look into when I'm doing archival research. It'll give you sort of a biographical history of the people that you're trying to learn about. It'll give you contextual information about who or about the provenance and how everything was acquired. And it'll also give you scope and content, which is basically just a fancy way of saying what is actually in there. So that's the really useful part. The other thing that you're going to want to know when you're searching materials is that everything is being, well, not everything, but most archives use standardized vocabularies. So if you're trying to find a term and you can't sort it out, it's not coming up and you know that they have something about that in the archive, you can go to Library of Congress subject headings or the thesaurus for graphic materials, type in what you're trying to find, and it will give you back the actual archival terminology. And then you can put that into the search bar and you will come up with something. I know that that was a lot of information, you guys. I think the most important thing you should take away from this is contact the archivist because they know everything. They know all the things that you don't know. So, and they're your best friend and your best asset when you're doing archival research. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you, Sarah. And just to echo that, in some ways, this workshop is really an homage to archivists. Are there additional things that people wanted to add on this topic?
There's a chat question from Reed Fedora.
There's a chat question.
Can you give the database name for archival vocabulary? Yeah, I can type that into the chat if you want.
Yeah, that would be great. Thank you. And thank you to Fiona McDonald, who is providing tech support for us. She's my colleague in anthropology and is running, I believe, running the chat and the Q&A for us today. Thank you, Fiona. Next up, we have Margaret Reeves, who is going to be talking about, if we can get a slide, can we get a slide changed? Yeah. Wonderful. Best practice number 5, which is don't assume all archives operate in the same way. So over to Margaret.
Hi, everyone. Well, the thing to remember about archives is that they have 2 competing tasks, and one is preservation of the materials in the archive, and the other is provision of access to those materials. And sometimes those, those tasks often shape the way you're required to approach an archive. So, for example, in a former life, I was curator of the Center for Reformation and Renaissance Studies in Toronto. And the only requirement for that archive is that you go in and sign in. No one checks your ID. And so it's very open, and the center's policy is want to encourage study of the Renaissance. The Fisher Library, which is also located in Toronto, requires you to register as a reader. And typically you need to be an established researcher, someone who's a graduate student or a faculty member at a university. The British Library in London has a more detailed process. You need to register as a reader, and I've put a little notice on the top left of the slide indicating that you actually have to make an appointment in order to register as a reader. You also have in the British Library 2 levels of registration. You can be a general reader to access the general collections. You also can be a more specialized reader. And for that, you need to have a letter of introduction, and you're only allowed access to materials in your area of expertise. I guess the takeaway is if you're going to travel to an archive, you need to make advanced preparation, know what you need. And that follows up from from what Dan was saying, from what Sarah was saying. So I have two examples from my own experience to illustrate this point. And I've got a little excerpt on the top right of the slide from Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own. And her narrator, Mary, wants to do some research in the library, and she's denied access by the library's guardian angel because she, as a woman, doesn't count as a fellow or a scholar. And of course, Room of One's Own was written in 1929. When I went to the Bodleian, I had my letter and my PhD in hand, and I was given access by the guardian angel at the time, but limited access. Every single request I made had to be approved by the archivist at the desk that day. I was luckier than the young German student who arrived at the same time as me, who didn't have his letter and he was denied access completely. By comparison, when I did my research at this library here, the Lillian H. Smith Library in Toronto, which houses the Osborne collection of early children's books, I wrote to the archivist ahead of time, explained my project, told her when I would be arriving. When I got there, signed in, registered as a reader, sat at the desk where I was directed, and in came a cartload of books, library cartload, filled on two sides, two shelves. And so I had all my material there ready, no waiting. And in the middle of the afternoon on the first day, one of the library assistants came up to me and said, "When will you be needing the other carts?" Turns out they had 3 more waiting there for me. So this goes to show that, yes, there is a level of gatekeeping, but it depends on how each archive negotiates the different demands between access and preservation. Thank you. No, I just wondered if we have any more.
Yeah, we've got a minute for questions. So
Yes, any questions or any additional comments? No, okay, thank you.
Thank you. I'm aware that there's some questions in the Q&A, a part of our presentation, so I will get to those. We'll have some time at the end, and we'll come back to those for sure. Thanks, Margaret. Our next,
that was just some visual candy I have to
our next best practice number 6 is being presented by Dr. Tim Paulson from the Department of History. Over to you.
Thank you, Karis. Hi, all. Hello, everyone. I'm Tim Paulson, and I was assigned this topic, and my first reaction to this topic was like, well, yeah, that happens. And it happens a lot. And I have some experience. I've used a lot of different kinds of archives. I use government archives, from presidential libraries to state archives, municipal archives. I've done this work in Canada, the United States, and Australia. I also use the archives of historical associations, corporations, universities, and unorganized personal collections. On top of that, I have written over 80 finding aids for disorganized collections. So I have a sense of like why this happens. And there's a lot of different reasons that you'll get this dissonance between the catalog and the content that you ultimately find. One is you have to think about the process by which these finding aids are created. And a lot of archives have a huge administrative backlog, huge bureaucratic backlog. There's a famous one in California that's 6 years behind on anything you give them. And anytime they're writing a finding aid, they're looking at 6 years of backlog right behind it. So it can be a rushed process. That's one reason. Another reason is that the creators of these finding aids don't have the job of anticipating your research questions. They're not necessarily designed to serve you, and you have to remember that. That's not what they're for. And so they might think about things differently because it is someone else's thinking. There's also mistakes and lost content. And the last thing I'll say, which I hope is the only thing, poor thing said about archivists, is that sometimes you get bad gatekeepers too, who will lie and hide content. It's very rare, but Margaret sort of spoke to the context in which it sometimes happens. And sometimes you just have to suck it up. So here's my tip. Tip number one, expect it. Expect that what you think you're going to find is not exactly what you're going to find. One way to help with that is extent. Sarah brought up extent, and I'm glad she did. It's a weird kind of jargon within archives. It's essentially if you took a tape measure on a shelf and you measure how much is there. But it gives you this sort of very vague but helpful sense of, okay, I've got this much in the finding aid. What does that look like in paper, right? And you can understand, okay, this is much bigger than I'm expecting, or it's much smaller, and you can adjust your expectations. As Jessica already said, you've got to communicate and correspond with the archives in advance the best you can. That's really, really essential. Sarah also mentioned the archivists. Because they live with it, they just know more than could possibly exist on the website. And so it's really helpful. I mentioned bad gatekeepers, but the truth is most archivists become your best friends. They're absolutely the best. I've had archivists offer me football tickets, right? It's wonderful. And getting in touch with them earlier and establishing those relationships will help with your research process. The next thing is ask why it looks different. If it looks different, ask why. Paige brought up this question of provenance versus pertinence. Ask provenance. Ask how did these records come to look this way, and try to make sense of why your approach didn't exactly turn up what you expected. Be prepared also to adjust your questions and your methods. I think this was alluded to as well. I think it's good as a historian, I'm a researcher, to come in with strong questions. I do believe in that, but you have to be prepared to adjust them, because if you don't find the thing that answers your question, you know, it probably still has something to say, and I'll say something else about that in a second. A colleague of mine once said to that point, people don't stash smoking guns in the archives, right? That's not what archives are, and you're not going to find the secret answer to your mystery. So sometimes you have to adjust your question to reflect what archives are for. And the last thing I'll say, archives reflect someone else's thinking, and so does the finding aid. They reflect someone else's thinking. So no matter what you find and what you don't find, there is always something to learn about someone else's thinking. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Are there questions for Tim or additional panelists want to add anything to this best practice? That's terrific. I'm reminded, Tim, from what you've said and what Margaret said as well, with the Virginia Woolf quote of something that Linda has written with Jessica Shawgirl in the Basements and Attics, Closets in Cyberspace, Explorations in Canadian Women's Archives, which is that no archives are neutral. And I think that's really resonating in some of the points here today. Thank you. Dr. Emily Murphy is up next, and she's going to tell us about being kind to archivists and collection staff, a very important best practice.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I think that this point can be one sentence. Okay, be kind, because like as a general rule of life, please don't be a jerk. But also, as has been alluded to a few times across the speakers already, the archivists live in, well, they don't literally live in the archives, but they are interacting with the archival material every day. And so the number of times that I have been absolutely astounded by the depth of knowledge that an archivist has had about what is ostensibly my research area. I can't even count the number of times. So as one example in particular, I have been doing research on a dancer in Canada from the 1930s who has no published material on her at all. And her collection is held in a very small archives in Toronto. And so because it is a small archives, there is, I don't even think that they have an assistant. I think there's just the archivist who works there. And the way that I came across this particular holding is because that archivist had put together a brochure and circulated it to dance studios across Toronto, and that's how I discovered it. And so now this is a forthcoming article because this particular archivist had a vested interest in this person's history, and then became like a great collaborator and has introduced me to so much material that was not in the finding aid, that was physical rather than textual, that required like particular aspects of care that I wouldn't have known even to ask for things, much less know that they were there. So rules for life and rules for archival research.
Thank you so much, Emily. Are there additional comments that people want to add? Questions to this, to best practice number 7? Margaret.
Well, just to underline what Emily said, one of the things that historical researchers are interested in, especially in relation to books and manuscripts, is provenance. And the archivist is the best and first resource for answering questions like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just going to repeat that back because I'm not sure it got picked up in the for the folks online, but Margaret was saying that one of the things that researchers that we're interested in, especially historical periods, but in general, is provenance, and archivists are truly the best source for that. Yeah, wonderful. Anything else? Okay, I want to learn about how you get the football tickets. But I feel like all of us as researchers have a story similar to that. Maybe not the football tickets, but something where an archivist has gone well above and out of their way. I myself have had someone where the rules where you could only work with one box at a time, but because I traveled like thousands of kilometers to be there and had a fairly short period of time, they let me have like multiple boxes at the same time. So things like that.
I was just thinking that when I was working on the transcription of letters, Emily Carr's letters, that the archivists were helpful at helping me decipher. I kept walking up to the desk saying, "Do you know what this is? What this word is?" And they were really wonderful and engaged in that process.
Yeah, they're fantastic. Thank you. Best practice number 8 is mine. It's about preparing your tech needs in advance. And I'm going to confess that I am so nerdy that I have an actual like archival research kit. Yeah, it's a little suitcase, it's like a little soft suitcase. And I've shown you in this picture what some of the things are that are in it. What's not in the picture is my laptop, and that is a key item for bringing to the archives. But what I do have in it as well is I have a tripod for my camera. I have a small camera that I have that has a wrist strap, and that is one of the things I've counted when I work at Library and Archives Canada. They want you to have your camera secured to your body so you don't drop it onto the archival materials. So in that case, a mobile phone, smartphone is not going to do the trick. You need to actually have a small camera with wrist strap. I have adapters for if I'm working in the UK or in other countries where I need to charge things. So I have those in my little kit. I have power for my laptop in case I run out, and also for my phone. I bring a clear plastic bag. That is something, if you visit Library and Archives Canada, you have to check your material or your stuff into a locker, and you can take a pencil, you can take things into the reading room with you, but you have to take it in with a clear plastic bag, and the security people have a look so that you're not making off with those archival materials. Don't ever do that. So that's practice number 11. Don't steal the archival materials. So you have, so I have my own that I just put things into so as I'm coming and going. What have I missed here? Pencil. It's my favorite piece of technology. It's probably the most important piece of technology, as well as paper going into the archive. And the last one is the also favorite technology of mine, which is the Post-it note. And I'm going to show you how I use that in the next slide. So when I take photos in the archives, and Emily is going to talk about that in the next best practice, I have this kind of method that I use where I, obviously with permission of the archivists, I have little post-it notes, just the little ones that are kind of strips. And I put the box number down and I put in pencil, and then I put the folder number down next to it. And I capture that in the actual photograph. And that is so, I've tried other ways where it's like, oh, I'll take a photograph of the folder first, and then I'll take, photographs of the materials after that. And you never really remember in the, after you go home, it's like, oh, do these photos go with that folder picture? And I know that some people also take pictures where they'll just tuck the folder number into the picture. This appeals to me because it's neat and tidy, and I can just swap it out and it makes a really neat photograph. And then you never ever lose where that, what that material is, because that has certainly happened to researchers where they look at the photographs, the research photographs they've taken, and they've gone, where did this come from? So that's, yeah. And I've, over the years, I used to start with just little pieces of paper that I put into the photos, and I found that they like blew away and slid all over the place. So the sticky notes have, and also this particular size of sticky note has been refined over many, many visits to the archives. And when I posted that on Twitter recently, Twitter got all excited about it. So I thought it was kind of a common thing, but apparently it's not. So that's my secret tip on tech. Any questions? Emily?
Bring scrap paper.
Scrap paper, yes. Yes, I celebrated the pencil, but not the notebook. Yeah, Tim.
I was just gonna say, you can be creative too with your tech. I got a little camera that's designed for people to be able to take selfies, but so it has a flip up screen, so it can go on a tripod. You can see it from your desk, which is
Terrific.
great. And it's just because people like selfies, so it's very available and cheap.
Super.
Yeah.
The selfie trap, that's fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Other tech, Emily.
Data backup.
Data backup.
Yes.
Oh, people are excited about this one.
Yes.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so likely, I mean, I take pictures on my phone. Probably most people will. Phones get full, and it's real scary to think that you would lose all of your research because your phone is somehow on the fritz. So usually I will use like a cloud folder as backup. I use Dropbox. But if you're using a camera, bring an extra SD card, bring an external hard drive. You don't want to waste weeks, months, years of your life.
Yes, extra SD card, external hard drive for backup and for moving documents at the end of the day when you go back to your hotel room or wherever you're staying. Excellent, thank you. We're on to best practice number 1. And over to Emily Murphy again. Thank you for doing 2.
No problem.
Okay, so this one is, I think, like a little bit more complicated than the last time that you guys heard from me, which is to set up an appropriate method for saving and processing your slides and photos. And really, an appropriate method is going to be based on how you work as a researcher, and also what your needs are for the project that you're completing. So much of the advice that I'm giving is assuming that you can take photos in the archives, which for most archival research now, it is the case that you can take photographs, but it's not a universal rule by any stretch. The some archives, you still cannot take photographs in. And I'll get a little bit more to that in a second. So in all cases, the primary thing that you're going to need to keep in mind is how you are going to cite your material. Since you are a researcher, your primary goal is to get a thing into something that is citable and circulatable. And so how are you going to cite it? Karis's technique of having the sticky notes in each of your pictures is a great way to know how exactly you're going to cite something, because it's going to give you the location of the item in the archives that you then need to put in your works cited. You also need to then figure out how to keep your notes in order. I am going to assume that most of you want to have some kind of running commentary on the material that you are researching, and how to keep those notes attached to the right document. So there's like more than one thing that you need to keep attached to the right document. So what I do is, before I get to the archives, I make a collection in a bibliographical management software called Zotero. There are many kinds of bibliographical management software, EndNote, Mendeley. Some of you might already use them. I use Zotero because it's open source. And I make that collection so that it lines up fairly closely with the way things are organized in the finding aid. As Tim has mentioned, it is not going to be 100% that whatever it is that you find then in the archives is going to match up with the finding aid, but it is a way of navigating then your own materials after the fact so that they match up with what is publicly available and then what is fairly easily citable. Here's something that kind of is going to come down to what it is that you're trying to do. If I were, say, writing an article, I would likely be looking fairly quickly through a lot of material until I find something that is relevant to a certain extent to the argument that I'm trying to make or the thing that I'm trying to find out about an author in my case, or some kind of like cultural actor. But when I was a fellow at the Harry Ransom Center in Austin, the thing that I was trying to do was to make a model, like a data model of how one particular author corresponded with other authors. And so I was looking through letters, which were represented in the finding aid, but there weren't descriptions, of course, in the finding aid of who the author was writing to at an item level, who they might have mentioned in the letters, what other works they might have mentioned, all of which were things that I was interested in as a researcher and interested really in being quite completist about as a researcher. Not all research is going to be completist in that way, but in this particular case, my research was. And so what I did is I made a spreadsheet. And in that spreadsheet, I kept track of the mentions of all of the things that I was interested in, the fact that they existed there, not necessarily like what I thought about them. And then that spreadsheet, which was quite tabular, became the basis for the data model that I was building later. So as you might imagine, that particular approach to archival research is very time consuming. Very time consuming. I had a fellowship for 3 months. And I used every second of it, every second. So most of you are probably not doing that kind of archival research, but you do need to think about like, well, what actually do you need? What do you need? How are you going to use it? How are you going to cite it? That's that.
Yeah, Judy, go ahead.
Do you use the tags in Zotero, or were all of your like categorizing stuff happening in your spreadsheet?
Most of the categorizing for me was happening in the spreadsheet. I don't really like the tags in Zotero. What I do like in Zotero, well, okay. The way that I like working with Zotero is to make like separate little note files for each document. Because then when you search something, it's like it shows up attached to that document instead of like in a big message text.
Great.
I wanted to add a reminder that even though many archives now allow us to use cameras and take photographs and materials, if you're going to publish the photograph in your article. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. That's coming up.
And the other thing that it's worth remembering is, and I just love your model, Karis, of the photograph with the box number and the folder number. Another reason it's so important to get it right is that when you publish your article, other readers of that article need to be able to find that item, and so it has, the numbering has to be correct.
Yeah, making sure that I'm just going to repeat it back for those who maybe didn't catch it on Zoom, that having your box and file numbers being absolutely accurate when you cite them, as Emily was saying in your article, so that other researchers can find that same material. Yeah, for sure. I wanted to add something that Emily reminded me of, and it's not a best practice exactly, but that there are fellowships available through many different libraries and collections. I'm just thinking about the Lilly Library in Indiana, which has a major fellowship. The Huntington, I believe, also has major fellowships so that you can come and spend extended periods of time there. So you apply for those. They're worth looking for online. So that would give you money to travel, and they usually have a sort of arrangement around accommodations, and they're fantastic. So do look for those. And without further ado, our final best practice is presented by Dr. Linda Morra.
I have to put the timer on for me. I have to be equitable about this. Okay. Here we go. So I'll start by saying that I took my students to the archives in Ottawa, the Library and Archives Canada, and we were perusing the archives of the Canadian writers Timothy Finlay and Jane Rule. We filled out the forms that the archives required. We entered the archive. And at one moment, one of my students fished out his cell phone to snap a pic of one of the documents we were looking at because he wanted to upload it to Facebook. Right, it was a teachable moment. Yes, exactly. It turned into a teachable moment. So first I explained that just because we had been granted permission to the archives didn't mean that we have permission to photograph the document or to reproduce the document. These are all different levels. So these require two separate levels of permission. And to be clear, being granted, again, access to the formal institution is not the same thing as being given the right to reproduce the materials, even in photographic form that is not for wider distribution. So I'm separating those two. The archival institution can grant us access to view materials, but not necessarily more than that. So permission error 101, given permission to access the archive does not grant access to reproduce or republish. Those who have a stake in the conversations, as you should already hear in some of the ways we've been talking about earlier today, are the following parties. First, the archives themselves. So that could be a formal institution, the archives at Simon Fraser or the archives at UBC or Library and Archives Canada. Two, the individual, corporation or family or executors who represent the individual also have a stake. Three, the institution with which you might be affiliated. So there's going to be a level of permission at that niveau, at that level as well. For the other named parties implied in the materials, and five, the publishing companies themselves. I want to add here something that I was thinking about while others were presenting today, and that has to do with the storage databases that one uses, because I think that we can throw materials up onto various databases and think that it's protected, but actually that is not the case. So we need to be careful about that as well. So once you've been granted access to an archive, you'll need the permission from the archives if you wish to photograph the documents for personal use of the materials. I do it all the time because I can't spend hours and hours in the archives. You've already heard why. If we have 2 weeks and the material, in the case of the author I'm working on, Jane Rule has something like 65 boxes. 2 weeks won't ever come close. So I photograph a lot so that I can work at home. After that, I need the permission of the author or the executor. If you're working on recent projects, although there might be other also parties involved. If it's the author, you have to have a very specific set of criteria by which you'll approach the author and or the executor. And then you would have to explain what boxes you wanted and why. The executors, in addition, look over, since in this project I'm talking about now, have looked over every document that I've published, every article I've published to look it over. Even before you approach the author or the executor, you must have provided them with a copy with an institutional permissions or consent form. And that's what I have up on the screen. This is the one that I had to develop. It had to be run by the ethics committee on campus. And so what you'll see is how very carefully worded these documents are and how they're designed to protect the parties you are researching and not you. So often when I'm approaching someone to interview someone, they'll look at those consent forms and they'll think, oh, it's to protect you, right? And my response always is, no, it's to protect you. So in this case, whoops, look at that. I'm the worst example ever. What I'll just quickly say is that I had to rewrite this about 5 times and then rewrite it a 6th time until we got it to this point. And that still does not deal with publishing companies and other levels of permission. So you have to really think about all of the levels of permissions that are involved in archives. It's not straightforward at all. Okay, I'll stop there. Oh, yeah, of course.
Thank you so much. Are there additional, Shashwan?
So I caught a little bit, I was snagged by the word other parties that are implied. So not necessarily even directly named, right? As being one of the potential stakeholders. And I'm so curious about that because
yes, of course.
like, what does that word
Other
mean to
stakeholders mean,
you,
yes.
And like, can you give an example of maybe
Several.
one of those, moments where another party was implied?
Sometimes we're talking about communities or indigenous communities, for example. So you want to make sure that you're getting that kind of consent, that you've actually developed the project before you even embark on the project, for example. A very specific example is when I worked on Jane Rule's Taking My Life, the memoir that she left in the archive, and then I saw it to publication. There are people who are named who are still alive in that memoir. And so when I ran it past the executors, what we then talked about was making sure that the people who were referenced in the memoir felt comfortable with their names being seen and visible, and that they were comfortable with what was about to be said. So it's about being accountable to, I think, other persons and communities when you're about to publish something.
Right.
It's a great question.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm aware that we're down to 6 minutes. And I just want to pull up the chat and see what questions folks have online.
Yeah, lots of clapping around the photos of Post-it notes.
It was my most popular tweet to date. I woke up one morning, I was like, why is my Twitter so like active? It's like, oh, it's all the archival nerds who are my family.
Ask a question while you look
Yes,
at the chat.
yes.
I wonder if anyone has used Trophy as a archival organization. So I think it's associated with Zotero, but it's designed for photos. It's one that I found, but I also always worry, like, okay, if the software goes out of date, there goes all of my organization that I've done inside this program that,
Yes.
you know, I don't know how widely used it is.
Well, so I don't know Trophy, but what I will say about that, I had only quickly referenced it in my comments, is that in my consent form, I explicitly say where I'll store the documents. That is actually part of the consent process. And so, for example, someone was telling me recently that they were using Google Docs to store their documents, which I would not advise people to do because that is not private. And if you're working with documents that are sensitive, that is not advisable. But I don't know Trophy, so I can't comment on that specifically.
Thanks for all the comments in the chat. I'm going to also collect them and I'll circulate some answers and information on the AmpLab blog as well to some of those questions for resources and links to things. And we're recording this as well, so I'll also circulate this after. I see that Chris Hives says, good news, Dan. I believe the Soyuz has moved to a new facility. No more barn swallows. Terrific, thanks, Hannah Paul.
Sorry, I'll shut up.
Hannah Paul has a great question here. Is it good or common practice to gift an archivist for their help? And Paige might be a good person to take that question.
I will try. Can you hear me?
Yeah, yes. Thank you.
So I would say that it's definitely not expected. It's never happened to me so far. And I would probably more appreciate a genuine expression of gratitude more than anything else.
Thank you. And this seems like a good moment to sort of say, and I think this is what Margaret's going to say with her hand up, that when we publish and when we work in the archives as researchers,
yes,
we always credit and thank the archivists and the staff in the archives who have helped us with that, facilitating those visits in our publications. That's an absolute best practice. That should be, I think.
Yes, I also always bring them chocolate or from wherever it is. So when I came from Montreal to Vancouver and I knew that I was going to see the archivists, I'm so grateful for what they do. I really mean, I bring them chocolate or ice wine or something to say thank you for all of the kinds of things that you're doing to support the work.
Yeah. Thank you, Margaret.
Also, the archives would appreciate a copy of your publication.
Oh, yes. The
yes,
archives appreciate a copy of your publication. Absolutely. Sending that to them. I feel like we could actually have like a whole other session where we just share as researchers, like the moments where archivists have gone above and beyond to help us. There's so many. I've been allowed into into boxes that have not been fully accessioned as well. It's just really outstanding. Amazing. People, that'll go out of your way to help you do the research. Thank you all to all the presenters. Thank you for everyone who's joined us online. I know people are coming from all over the place and different time zones. We really appreciate your attending. And also to Dan Keyes' class, who we have like piloted this workshop into. Thank you for having us. Linda is giving a talk in 15 minutes over at the AMP Lab. If you registered for this workshop, you have the link for that talk, and I hope we'll see you over there. Thank you for coming. Thank you.